Concrete and blood rain together over an abandoned district as gunmetal helicopters tilt into the night and searchlights etch the sky. A single, unimpressed man in a plain yellow suit stands at the edge of a crater, hands in pockets, watching as something older than history peels through brick and steel. Vans meant to contain monsters have become twisted shells, and the Hellsing black-clad operatives move with a calm that smells like panic. Because what they expected, a vampire hunt, a clean surgical engagement, is not what arrives. From the smoke comes metallic laughter and the clank of servo parts as a cyborg accelerates into a blur while, across an alley, a psychic wind steadies a woman in a fur coat who is already cutting deals with ghosts. No one knows how to file this under normal threat levels, and everyone in uniform is about to discover that the rules have changed. This is only the beginning. Worse is coming. If you want the truth about what happens when unstoppable boredom meets immortal hunger, subscribe now and stay for every part. This isn't harmless fanplay, it's a warning. Keep watching or you'll miss how the world breaks when they collide. The sky above London fractures without warning, as if the air itself has been punched from the inside, and every surveillance satellite pointed at Western Europe glitches at the exact same second. A shockwave rolls outward over the Thames, rippling the water in a perfect circle before slamming into rooftops hard enough to shatter glass across 3 districts. Car alarms scream in unison while pedestrians collapse from the pressure drop, and in the center of a deserted financial courtyard, a crater forms with surgical precision, asphalt curling upward like torn paper. When the dust settles, 4 figures stand at the center of the impact, as though they stepped off an elevator rather than through dimensions. Saitama blinks once at the gray skyline and checks a grocery receipt still crumpled in his hand, mildly annoyed that the discount day might not apply here. Genos is already scanning heat signatures and electromagnetic distortions, his eyes flashing with data overlays that refuse to categorize the atmospheric residue. King's heartbeat thunders audibly in the unnatural silence, the rhythmic rumble echoing off shattered glass in a way that sounds less human and more like distant artillery. Fubuki steadies herself mid-air, telekinetic field expanding instinctively around the group, as she measures the psychic pressure in the air, and realizes this world is saturated with something older than Esper energy. Miles away inside the fortified halls of the Hellsing organization, alarms do not blare. They click quietly into a higher state of readiness because this institution does not panic, it escalates. Sir Integra Hellsing stands before a wall of live feeds showing the crater, her expression unmoved as analysts report gravitational anomalies and biological signatures that match no known vampire strain. The classification moves instantly from unknown to strategic without debate, because whatever caused that shockwave did not resemble conventional sorcery or Millennium weaponry. She orders a reconnaissance unit deployed with live feed relay and anti-ghoul clearance, not to engage, but to observe and evaluate the threat's chain of command. The first Hellsing operatives arrive in armored vans that skid to a stop at the perimeter, rifles raised but disciplined, forming a containment arc around the crater. Genos steps forward immediately, interpreting the formation as hostile encirclement, and politely instructs them to stand down for their own safety. His tone is measured, almost courteous, but the glow building in his palms melts the rain before it hits the pavement. Saitama watches the exchange with distant curiosity, wondering aloud if this is some kind of hero registration checkpoint, and whether they stamp passports for interdimensional travel. The misunderstanding calcifies in seconds because one nervous operative misreads Genos' energy buildup as a pre-attack charge and fires a blessed round meant for undead penetration. The bullet strikes Genos' shoulder plating and detonates with a flash of consecrated light, carving molten metal from his arm and sending him skidding back through the crater wall. He recalculates instantly, now aware that the ammunition carries a supernatural payload that disrupts his internal stabilizers more efficiently than expected. Civilians are still within a 3-block radius, and Genos' priority tree flips to maximum suppression before collateral damage multiplies. He launches forward in a blur, plasma incinerating asphalt in a straight-line dash that disarms 3 operatives without killing them, precisely melting rifles at their receivers. The remaining Hellsing agents respond with disciplined crossfire using silvered ammunition, forcing Genos to deploy a rotating barrier of heat to intercept trajectories he cannot fully predict due to the occult charge embedded in each round. Fubuki extends her psychic field outward, catching 2 incoming projectiles midair and crushing them into harmless fragments while shouting for both sides to stop escalating. King stands at the center of the chaos, unmoving, the sheer sound of his heartbeat causing several operatives to hesitate as if some apex predator has chosen not to attack yet. Inside the Hellsing command chamber, Integra watches King's still posture and misinterprets the scene entirely, concluding that the bald man and the cyborg are subordinates positioned defensively around their silent leader. She authorizes the release of a higher asset for field evaluation, not because her soldiers are losing, but because the anomaly must be understood quickly before it spreads beyond London. The order is delivered with clinical calm. Deploy Alucard at level 0, restraint pending threat confirmation. The air above the crater darkens unnaturally as shadows lengthen against physics, and from within a spiraling distortion steps Alucard, hat brim low, coat flaring in a wind that does not exist. He surveys the scene with amused interest, eyes settling first on King, whose oppressive aura hums like a war drum. For a moment Alucard smiles, believing he has found something worthy of indulgence, and then his gaze shifts to Saitama, who is picking dust off his cape with mild irritation. The vampire's instincts falter for half a second, not from fear but from confusion, because Saitama does not register on any spectrum of life, death, or hunger. Alucard fires first, twin pistols roaring with rounds forged to obliterate regenerating monstrosities, and the bullets cross the distance faster than human sight. They hit Saitama squarely in the chest and flatten against his suit, as if striking reinforced concrete, dropping harmlessly to the ground. Saitama looks down at the ruined fabric and sighs, commenting that he just replaced this costume last week. The battlefield freezes, every faction recalculating in real time, because durability beyond supernatural scaling was not on anyone's report. Genos pivots toward Alucard, identifying him as the primary hostile due to projectile origin and abnormal biosignature, and unleashes a focused incineration blast designed to vaporize high regeneration entities. The beam engulfs Alucard entirely, tearing through nearby buildings and forcing Fubuki to erect a telekinetic wall to prevent further structural collapse. When the flames subside, Alucard stands intact, laughing as shredded flesh knits itself together in grotesque elegance. His regeneration functions perfectly, and the demonstration shifts Hellsing's threat assessment from strategic to potentially existential within seconds. Fubuki senses the immortality at work and realizes brute force alone may prolong the engagement unnecessarily, so she attempts direct psychic restraint, compressing invisible pressure around Alucard's limbs. For a brief moment his movements slow, and she considers negotiation, announcing that they are not invaders but displaced heroes seeking orientation. Alucard allows the restraint out of curiosity rather than necessity, then dissolves into a swarm of shadowed familiars that slip through her psychic grip like smoke through fingers. The tactic fails not because she is weak, but because this opponent does not obey biological cohesion. King's heartbeat grows louder as stray familiars circle him, and Hellsing operatives interpret his stillness as supreme confidence rather than paralyzing fear. None dare approach him, and even Alucard pauses, sensing that whatever King represents may eclipse the entertainment value of lesser prey. Saitama scratches his head and finally steps forward, not out of anger but because the noise is becoming inconvenient and he would like to find out where he is. He asks Alucard, in a perfectly neutral tone, if there is someone in charge he can talk to. Alucard responds with delighted gunfire and lunges, claws extending as he tests the bald man's reaction speed. Saitama shifts half a step, avoiding the strike without drama, and taps Alucard lightly in the chest with a single finger. The contact is casual, almost absent-minded, yet the impact detonates the air behind the vampire, launching him through 3 buildings and carving a trench down the street that will never be repaired. For the first time since his release, Alucard's regeneration hesitates for a fraction longer than expected, not failing, but acknowledging that something fundamental has opposed it. Every camera in London captures the shockwave, and every political authority monitoring Hellsing realizes this is no routine supernatural flare-up. The crater has become a battleground between incompatible systems of power, and neither side fully understands the other. As Alucard rises from rubble with eyes burning brighter than before, restraints loosening incrementally, Integra issues a new command that cannot be taken back. Escalate authorization. Remove remaining limits. The night is no longer a containment scenario. It is an unfolding anomaly with global consequences already in motion. Alucard rises from the trench Saitama carved through London like something dredged up from the bottom of history, coat in tatters, hat gone, eyes burning with a widening grin that is no longer amused but awakened. The buildings behind him continue collapsing in delayed sequence, each impact echoing across the financial district and triggering seismic alerts as if a localized earthquake has struck the capital. Surveillance drones circle at a safer altitude now, their operators instructed not to interfere after witnessing a vampire thrown like debris by a single casual gesture. The classification update spreads through British intelligence channels in real time. Existential anomaly confirmed. Cross-dimensional probability high. Inside Hellsing headquarters, Integra does not raise her voice when she authorizes further release levels, but the room temperature seems to drop as the command propagates through occult seals binding Alucard's deeper states. She understands the political cost of unleashing him publicly, yet she also recognizes that the yellow-suited man standing casually in a crater has already shattered conventional threat models. Reports confirm that blessed ammunition and anti-undead protocols have zero measurable effect on him, while his associates' plasma output rivals military-grade bombardment. This is no longer a territorial misunderstanding. It is a paradigm collision unfolding in the open streets of London. Genos hovers above the crater, internal systems recalibrating after the earlier consecrated impact destabilized his shoulder actuators. He has mapped Alucard's regenerative cycle and determined that energy saturation alone will not suffice, because the vampire's existence appears distributed across multiple metaphysical anchors rather than singular biology. Civilian evacuation is incomplete, and every additional shockwave increases the probability of structural domino collapse. His tactical solution tree branches toward high-yield incineration followed by atmospheric ionization, though he hesitates because collateral damage projections spike beyond acceptable hero thresholds. Fubuki senses the escalation before it manifests physically, feeling pressure in the air like a storm system folding inward. She expands her telekinetic field to stabilize debris fields across 3 city blocks, preventing falling concrete from crushing trapped civilians beneath collapsed parking structures. The effort strains her concentration, not because she lacks power, but because the ambient supernatural energy here resists psychic containment in unpredictable ways. She glances at Saitama, who remains standing with the same detached posture, cape fluttering lazily in a wind generated by destruction rather than weather. King has not moved from the crater's edge, yet his presence has shifted the psychological balance of the battlefield more dramatically than any visible attack. Hellsing operatives whisper into comms that the silent man must be the apex commander, perhaps a rival immortal whose restraint is the only thing preventing total annihilation. Even Alucard studies him briefly before refocusing on Saitama, choosing instinct over analysis. The Millennium, observers hidden in London's underground network mark King as priority alpha for potential capture, misreading his thunderous heartbeat as contained catastrophic power. Alucard spreads his arms as restraints dissolve in crimson vapor, and the ground beneath him darkens as if absorbing centuries of accumulated death. Shadows pool outward, forming writhing silhouettes of familiars that crawl across walls and over abandoned vehicles, their shapes barely human and utterly obedient. His regeneration stabilizes into something more robust, less reactive and more anticipatory, as if every prior death has been rehearsing for this moment. He addresses Saitama directly now, voice layered with countless echoes, acknowledging him not as prey but as anomaly. Saitama listens politely, nodding once as though someone has just explained train delays, and then asks whether all of this is necessary because he is starting to miss dinner. The casual tone collides violently with the apocalyptic spectacle unfolding around them, creating a dissonance that unsettles both allies and enemies. Alucard laughs, not insulted but invigorated, interpreting the indifference as either supreme arrogance or supreme power. He vanishes into a tidal surge of shadows that crashes towards Saitama from every direction simultaneously. Genos reacts first, firing concentric incineration rings that vaporize waves of familiars before they reach civilians still fleeing through adjacent streets. His blasts carve incandescent arcs through the night, yet for every dozen shadows erased, more rise from the asphalt as if the city itself is bleeding silhouettes. Fubuki redirects a collapsing crane with precise psychic torque, preventing it from crushing a hospital wing already operating on emergency generators. The conflict is no longer a duel. It has expanded into environmental warfare where the city itself becomes a casualty. Alucard reforms directly behind Saitama, claws extending toward his neck in a strike meant not to kill but to measure. The blow lands against Saitama's skin and stops as though meeting a wall that does not acknowledge impact. Saitama turns slowly, mildly curious, and taps Alucard's forehead with 2 fingers this time, applying slightly more intention than before. The resulting shockwave obliterates the shadow swarm across a 5-block radius, clearing the sky in an instant and sending a pressure dome outward that extinguishes fires Genos had inadvertently started. For several seconds, London is quiet. Then Alucard reconstitutes again, slower but undeniably functional, stepping out of a crater deeper than the first and wiping blood from his mouth with delighted reverence. His immortality has not failed, but it has been challenged in a way no holy weapon or sacred blade has ever achieved. The realization spreads through Hellsing command like cold fire. This man in yellow can damage even boundless regeneration without ritual, without artifact, without invocation. The power system collision has moved from theoretical to demonstrable. Integra's next decision is political as much as tactical. She orders perimeter lockdown across a wider radius and instructs British military liaisons to stand by without engaging. Public broadcasts begin labeling the event as a contained terrorist incident, though every live-streamed clip contradicts that narrative in seconds. Social media explodes with footage of a bald man standing unharmed at the center of supernatural devastation. Millennium intercepts those feeds and accelerates their own agenda, seeing in Saitama not merely a threat but a potential catalyst for global destabilization. Anderson, watching from Vatican channels, interprets the scene through a lens of faith and heresy, concluding that such unclassified power cannot be allowed to roam unchecked. Preparations begin quietly for intervention under the banner of divine correction. The conflict is widening beyond London streets, drawing in institutions that have waited centuries for apocalyptic signs. Back in the crater, Alucard's grin sharpens as he acknowledges the only opponent who has made him feel something close to anticipation in decades. He speaks of war, of release without limit, of seeing how deep the bald anomaly's strength truly descends. Saitama tilts his head, considering whether a stronger punch might end the noise faster, but he refrains because no one has clearly explained why they are fighting in the first place. That hesitation changes everything. Because in that pause, with Alucard escalating toward deeper release and global powers mobilizing in response, the situation crosses a threshold it cannot return from. This is no longer a territorial clash between a vampire and misplaced heroes. It is the ignition point of institutional panic on an international scale, and the world is already choosing sides. By the time dawn threatens the London skyline, the financial district no longer resembles an accident scene. It resembles a controlled war zone sealed by authority rather than chaos. Military transport vehicles block every arterial road within a 5-mile radius, and satellite feeds have been scrubbed from public access under emergency national security clauses. The British government does not deny something occurred, but it reclassifies the cause as a coordinated extremist attack involving experimental weaponry, carefully avoiding any mention of immortals or men who ignore bullets. What they cannot hide is the skyline itself, permanently altered by 2 shockwaves that carved architecture into abstract ruin. Inside Hellsing headquarters, Sir Integra convenes an emergency strategic council with representatives from British intelligence, defense, and select occult divisions. The language used is precise and clinical, yet the implications are unmistakable. The bald anomaly demonstrated force output surpassing anti-regeneration thresholds, while the cyborg exhibited city-level incineration capability restrained only by civilian ethics. Alucard remains active but has not been neutralized, and his regeneration latency increased measurably after direct physical contact with the anomaly. That detail alone changes centuries of internal doctrine. The classification officially upgrades from potentially existential to active existential threat. Genos stands atop a damaged skyscraper, scanning London's altered electromagnetic landscape while emergency sirens echo below. His shoulder plating has been temporarily reinforced using onboard nanofabrication, but the consecrated ammunition residue continues to interfere with certain sensor predictions. He has concluded that this world's supernatural signatures do not obey standard energy conservation principles, meaning conventional escalation risks unpredictable feedback loops. Nevertheless, his loyalty tree is simple. If civilians are endangered again, he will escalate regardless of structural damage. Fubuki has established a temporary psychic perimeter around the crater zone, coordinating evacuation routes through telepathic nudges rather than overt displays. She understands something the others do not articulate. This world is organized, institutional, and suspicious, and open confrontation will only accelerate militarized response. Her instinct is negotiation, but negotiation requires someone willing to speak instead of fire. She approaches Saitama cautiously, explaining that they may have triggered a global response cycle that will not simply disappear. Saitama listens with mild curiosity while examining the cracked pavement, nodding that this city's supermarkets might not accept yen. He does not appear concerned about global response cycles or existential classifications. He is more interested in whether the vampire from last night intends to continue the fight, or if someone can explain the rules here. His detachment does not come from ignorance but from scale. None of what happened registered as a real challenge to him. The crater, the shockwaves, the political mobilization, all of it feels like someone else's problem expanding outward. King, meanwhile, has been escorted under armed supervision to a secured observation room within Hellsing headquarters, not as a prisoner, but as a presumed apex entity requiring diplomatic caution. His heart pounds so loudly that reinforced glass vibrates subtly, and every officer in the room interprets it as restrained power barely contained. They speak to him with formal respect, asking questions about dimensional travel and chain of command, never realizing that his silence is pure terror wrapped in reputation. The myth around King grows in real time, and Hellsing begins drafting contingency files under his name alone. Integra makes a calculated decision that diverges from her initial containment protocol. Instead of immediate termination attempts, she issues what becomes known internally as the Hellsing Directive. Observe, engage diplomatically if possible, and provoke only if national survival demands it. The reasoning is simple. If Saitama can damage Alucard without ritual or relic, then he represents either the greatest weapon Britain has ever encountered or its final adversary. Destroying him blindly would be strategic suicide, without understanding the mechanics behind his power. Millennium intercepts fragments of these internal discussions through embedded assets and accelerates their own timetable. To them, dimensional anomalies are not threats but opportunities, and a being capable of overriding immortal regeneration is a potential keystone in reshaping global hierarchy. Orders are issued to deploy reconnaissance vampires into London's underbelly, not to attack directly, but to test response thresholds and observe interaction patterns between the newcomers and Hellsing forces. The conflict is no longer confined to open streets. It is migrating into intelligence warfare. Alucard, restrained but restless, returns to Hellsing headquarters voluntarily after the prior night's confrontation, his regeneration fully restored, yet marked by something unfamiliar memory of impact that bypassed metaphysical buffering. He stands before Integra and speaks candidly, acknowledging that the bald man is neither holy weapon nor demonic construct, but something structurally alien to their cosmology. He requests permission for deeper release in the next engagement, not out of desperation, but curiosity sharpened into obsession. Integra does not grant it yet. Elsewhere in the city, a minor incident shifts the trajectory of events irreversibly. A cluster of Millennium scouts attacks a hospital evacuation convoy, assuming the Saitama team will respond with predictable heroics. Genos detects the assault first and arrives within seconds, plasma cannons deploying at maximum safe output. The vampires regenerate through conventional incineration faster than anticipated, their bodies reforming from charred fragments with cruel efficiency. Civilians are seconds from slaughter when Saitama finally arrives, having followed the smoke trail more out of convenience than urgency. He steps between a lunging vampire and a child frozen in terror, and without visible effort he flicks the attacker's forehead. The vampire does not explode, it disappears. Not scattered, not regenerating, erased from the equation as though the concept of its immortality never existed. The surrounding Millennium operatives freeze, their regenerative anchors offering no reassurance because what they witnessed did not damage the body. It invalidated it. Genos halts mid-blast, recalculating as data streams show zero residual biomass where the target once stood. This is the first permanent loss inflicted upon Millennium forces by direct physical contact alone. News of the erasure spreads through hidden channels faster than official reports can contain it, and the strategic implications are immediate. Immortality is no longer guaranteed against this anomaly. Hellsing updates its internal doctrine again, this time acknowledging that Saitama's strikes do not merely overpower regeneration, they override the underlying metaphysical contract sustaining it. The world's response shifts accordingly. British military command begins drafting contingency plans involving heavy artillery not to defeat Saitama, but to test his upper durability limits under controlled provocation. The Vatican accelerates Anderson's deployment timeline, interpreting the erasure as blasphemous negation of divine balance. Millennium revises its objective from exploitation to acquisition at any cost, recognizing that control over such force could rewrite centuries of undead dominance. Back in the hospital courtyard, Saitama looks down at the empty space where the vampire once stood and remarks that the guy probably should not have attacked a kid. There is no triumph in his tone, only mild practicality. Yet that single flick has altered global strategy matrices overnight, proving that immortality in this universe has a ceiling, and he stands above it. As sirens converge and shadows retreat to reassess, a new phase begins, one driven not by confusion but by deliberate system response. The institutions of this world are no longer asking who the newcomers are. They are asking how to survive them. London does not wake up to recovery. It wakes up to containment grids, armored checkpoints, and a skyline that still smolders from the night before. News outlets repeat the word terrorism with disciplined insistence, but the footage leaking through encrypted channels tells a different story, shadows swallowing streets, a man in yellow standing at the center of a pressure wave, and something erased so completely that not even ash remained. Public panic does not reset to curiosity. It escalates into migration as entire boroughs begin evacuating voluntarily, unwilling to trust official reassurances. The city is no longer reacting to an incident. It is bracing for recurrence. The Hellsing organization expands its operational radius beyond standard vampire suppression doctrine, deploying units not only to hunt Millennium scouts, but to monitor the Saitama team's movements in parallel. Sir Integra understands that coexistence without clarity is a strategic risk, yet open hostility risks annihilation. The Hellsing directive evolves into layered surveillance, diplomatic probes, and contingency drafting for urban-scale engagement. Alucard, restless and smiling, is placed on partial release authorization, pending confirmed hostile escalation from either Millennium or the anomaly himself. Millennium chooses escalation. Across the Thames, coordinated vampire cells initiate simultaneous strikes at infrastructure nodes, power substations, rail hubs, communication towers, not to defeat Saitama, but to stretch his response capacity. It is a tactical development unlike previous direct confrontations. Instead of a single battlefield, the city becomes a chessboard of crises. Fires ignite across districts while black-clad figures descend through smoke, forcing emergency services into paralysis. The goal is clear: force the anomaly to choose where to stand. Genos detects the distributed assault pattern instantly and launches skyward, dividing his processing cores to calculate optimal intercept routes. He prioritizes civilian density clusters, vaporizing vampire squads before they can entrench, yet regeneration keeps pace with destruction in several sectors. His incineration beams carve through warehouses and train yards, carefully angled to minimize collateral collapse, but the sheer number of simultaneous incidents strains even his advanced predictive modeling. This is no longer a duel, it is systemic stress testing. Fubuki remains near central London, establishing a telekinetic stabilization grid over evacuation corridors. She coordinates with Hellsing officers directly now, recognizing that institutional cooperation reduces chaos. Her psychic field deflects falling debris, redirects vehicles away from ambush zones, and pins regenerating vampires long enough for Hellsing operatives to apply blessed restraints. The collaboration is uneasy but functional, marking the first tactical alignment between worlds that do not understand each other. King is transported under heavy escort to a fortified underground command annex after Millennium intelligence flags him as a probable keystone entity. His presence alone alters enemy behavior. Several vampire units withdraw upon detecting his proximity, unwilling to test what they assume is restrained devastation. Hellsing analysts interpret this hesitation as confirmation of his apex status, further entrenching the myth. King says nothing, because any attempt to speak risks collapsing the illusion that now shields him more effectively than armor. Saitama, meanwhile, stands atop a partially collapsed bridge, watching smoke rise from 3 different directions. He considers the situation with mild annoyance rather than urgency, noting that whoever is orchestrating this seems intent on making the city inconvenient. When a cluster of vampires surges toward fleeing commuters below, he drops down with casual precision and delivers a sideways punch meant simply to clear space. The resulting shockwave does not just scatter the attackers. It flattens an entire block of hostile presence, leaving a vacuum corridor through which civilians escape unharmed. That corridor remains clear. Unlike previous regenerating assaults, the vampires caught directly in the path of his strike do not reconstitute elsewhere. Millennium observers confirm through occult sensors that the erased units have not retreated to metaphysical reserves. They are gone permanently. Immortality under distributed assault has limits when absolute force is applied with intention. This realization shifts Millennium's operational doctrine mid-battle from distributed harassment to targeted capture planning. Hellsing's response evolves simultaneously. Integra authorizes Alucard to engage Millennium forces at higher release thresholds, not to test Saitama, but to prevent the city from fracturing entirely. Alucard descends into the chaos with predatory delight, shadow armies colliding with rival undead across rooftops in a spectacle that warps the skyline into something infernal. His regeneration remains intact, but he fights with new caution when Saitama is nearby, aware that proximity to that casual fist could end even him. The Vatican enters the equation publicly for the first time. Father Anderson arrives in London under ecclesiastical sanction, interpreting the distributed violence and supernatural erasures as apocalyptic signs demanding intervention. He does not coordinate with Hellsing initially. His mission is purification, not diplomacy. When he witnesses Saitama eliminating a regenerating vampire with a flick, his faith reframes the bald hero as either divine instrument or blasphemous aberration. He chooses the latter, escalating the conflict's nature from strategic to theological. The first encounter between Anderson and Saitama occurs not in a grand duel, but in the middle of a burning transit station where civilians are trapped beneath twisted steel. Anderson drives blessed bayonets into a swarm of vampires with ferocious precision, carving through immortal flesh while shouting scripture that reverberates like artillery. Saitama lifts a collapsed support beam one-handed, freeing survivors without ceremony. Their eyes meet briefly across the smoke, and in that exchange the city feels the collision of incompatible belief systems. Anderson attacks. His blade strikes Saitama's torso with enough force to shatter reinforced concrete, yet they bend harmlessly against skin that does not acknowledge sanctified steel. The priest escalates instantly, activating regenerative scripture-based enhancements that push his physiology beyond human thresholds. Saitama sidesteps without visible effort and taps Anderson's shoulder, sending him through a concrete pillar without breaking bone. It is not humiliation, it is mismatch. The sight freezes both Hellsing operatives and Millennium scouts alike. For the first time, two opposing institutions witness a holy weapon fail against the same anomaly that bypasses vampiric immortality. The implications are irreversible. This is not a creature aligned with heaven or hell. It is something outside their binary structure entirely. As night falls again, London burns in controlled sectors while combined forces attempt stabilization. Casualty numbers climb despite containment success, and international observers begin mobilizing advisory fleets under the pretext of humanitarian support. The city has shifted from incident site to global flashpoint in under 48 hours. And beneath the chaos, Millennium activates a deeper contingency, one not aimed at defeating Saitama directly, but at forcing him into a confrontation designed to measure the upper boundary of his indifference. The siege is no longer about London. It is about provoking a punch strong enough to break the world. By the third night, London is no longer described internally as a city under siege. It is designated a controlled combat environment under provisional wartime authority. Parliament does not convene publicly, but emergency powers are enacted behind closed doors, granting military command joint operational status alongside the Hellsing organization. Foreign governments issue formal statements of support while quietly repositioning naval assets within range of British airspace. The classification of the anomaly is no longer confined to intelligence briefings. It is written into defense protocol as an unpredictable variable capable of invalidating known supernatural and conventional hierarchies alike. The British Armed Forces initiate Operation Black Spire, a layered military escalation designed not to attack indiscriminately, but to map durability ceilings under controlled provocation. Satellite-linked artillery platforms are placed on standby, electromagnetic pulse systems are recalibrated for cross-spectrum deployment, and experimental kinetic penetrators originally designed for anti-armor warfare are reauthorized for domestic contingency use. The objective is cautious but clear. Determine whether the bald anomaly can be measured, or if he exists outside measurable parameters entirely. Hellsing is not informed of the full operational details at first. Sir Integra senses the shift immediately when radar grids expand beyond vampire tracking patterns and military liaisons begin withholding data under classified seals. She understands political survival. If the government believes Saitama represents a potential threat beyond her control, they will test him regardless of diplomatic efforts. Alucard, standing near the command balcony with a smile that suggests anticipation rather than concern, remarks that humans always fire at what they fear before attempting conversation. Integra does not disagree, but she recognizes that once the military engages, there will be no narrative of containment left to salvage. Genos detects the satellite targeting locks seconds before activation. His sensors register high-velocity projectiles entering terminal descent from upper atmosphere platforms positioned over the North Sea. The trajectories do not aim for population centers, but for the crater zone where Saitama stands absent-mindedly examining a bent traffic light. Genos intercepts midair, firing upward in an attempt to vaporize the incoming rods before impact, but the penetrators are encased in layered alloys designed to resist plasma dispersion. He recalculates instantly and diverts energy to deflection vectors instead, altering the angle of descent so the projectiles slam into the Thames rather than central London. The resulting water displacement still floods lower boroughs. Saitama watches the sky brighten briefly, then fade, mildly impressed that someone bothered to try something different. He leaps once, not dramatically but efficiently, landing atop the hull of a naval destroyer positioned just beyond the Thames estuary. Sailors freeze as he peers down at them and asks whether they are practicing fireworks. The sheer casualness of his presence on a classified military vessel fractures the chain of command more effectively than any attack could. Back in London, Fubuki senses the broader implication. This is no longer about vampires or rogue factions. Human institutions are escalating independently, driven by fear that power beyond comprehension cannot be allowed autonomy. She contacts Hellsing directly, urging immediate mediation before further provocation, triggers consequences no side can predict. Integra responds by dispatching an armored convoy toward the river, intent on confronting military leadership face-to-face if necessary. Millennium observes all of it with predatory patience. They anticipated military intervention and seeded false intelligence, suggesting that Saitama's power might fluctuate under sustained bombardment. Their true objective is not his defeat but data acquisition. Beneath London's underground rail network, a specialized occult device activates, an array designed to amplify dimensional instability around high-output energy signatures. If Saitama responds to escalation with increased force, the device will record and potentially harness the resonance. The next strike is not kinetic. A coordinated electromagnetic cascade erupts from concealed platforms around the city, targeting Genos specifically. The pulse is layered with occult frequencies derived from captured vampire relics, designed to disrupt both machine and supernatural harmonics simultaneously. Genos absorbs the first wave through reinforced shielding, but secondary surges bypass predictive models and overload several peripheral systems. He crashes through a warehouse roof, smoke rising from damaged actuators as he struggles to stabilize power flow. Civilians trapped nearby are seconds from being exposed to stray energy arcs. Saitama returns to the city in a single bound, landing beside Genos as arcs of corrupted electricity lash across shattered concrete. He places one hand casually on Genos' shoulder, grounding the discharge without visible strain, and then looks upward toward the hidden emission source. There is no anger in his expression, only mild inconvenience that someone has damaged his disciple's hardware. He jumps. The rooftop array generating the cascade disappears under a single downward punch, the building beneath it collapsing inward as if gravity briefly intensified. Shockwaves ripple through adjacent structures, yet the epicenter remains confined to the emission node. Millennium's underground device records the resonance spike and immediately overloads, unable to process output that does not follow dimensional logic. Data streams corrupt into white noise. The military halts further strikes. Operation Black Spire is suspended not because it succeeded, but because it failed to produce meaningful metrics. The anomaly's durability is not simply high, it is indifferent. Every escalation either redirects or disappears under minimal effort, and attempts to measure him risk catastrophic collateral blowback. British command issues a quiet stand-down order, framing the decision publicly as stabilization success. But the consequences have already cascaded. Anderson interprets the military assault and Saitama's effortless negation as proof that secular authority cannot govern such power. He prepares for unilateral engagement under Vatican sanction. Alucard, sensing the shift toward ideological confrontation, requests full release again, eager to test whether faith-enhanced aggression can achieve what artillery could not. Integra hesitates, aware that unleashing both forces simultaneously could fracture not just London, but the fragile political equilibrium barely holding. Genos rises from the wreckage, systems partially restored, and apologizes for failing to intercept all threats. Saitama tells him not to worry and asks if there is anywhere nearby selling food that is still open. The absurd normalcy of the question in the middle of near-war authorization unsettles even hardened Hellsing operatives, because they are beginning to understand something terrifying. Saitama is not escalating with the world. The world is escalating around him. And the next move will not come from artillery or shadow armies, but from belief itself, sharpened into a weapon aimed directly at the anomaly standing at the center of it all. The announcement does not come through press conferences or diplomatic cables. It arrives through a sudden shift in presence across London, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Clergy in black cassocks begin appearing at military checkpoints, speaking quietly with officers before moving on without resistance. Armored transports bearing Vatican insignia cross into British jurisdiction under emergency ecclesiastical exemption, their manifests sealed under centuries-old accords rarely invoked. This is not invasion and it is not alliance, it is intervention. The Vatican has authorized autonomous action. Father Alexander Anderson does not wait for formal coordination with Hellsing this time. He stands at the center of St. Paul's Cathedral as dusk bleeds into the sky, reciting scripture that resonates unnaturally through stone that has survived wars and fire alike. Around him, elite Iscariot operatives prepare consecrated weaponry calibrated specifically for anomaly engagement. Intelligence compiled over the past 48 hours has reshaped their theology in real time. The bald man in yellow is neither confirmed demon nor angel, which to Anderson makes him something more dangerous, a disruption of divine structure. Hellsing detects the mobilization too late to prevent it. Integra receives word that Anderson has deployed independently towards central London, where Saitama currently stands beside a convenience store whose windows were hastily repaired after previous shockwaves. She curses the lack of coordination not out of fear for Saitama's safety, but because simultaneous engagement between Iscariot and the anomaly risks catastrophic crossfire. Alucard, standing in shadow nearby, grins with predatory amusement at the inevitability of collision. Genos senses incoming hostiles before visual confirmation. Dozens of heartbeats approach in disciplined formation, none vampiric, none mechanical. He steps forward automatically, shoulder cannons deploying with a mechanical hiss, but Saitama raises a hand casually and tells him to wait. The tone is mild, almost bored, yet it carries finality. Genos complies, though every threat assessment subroutine urges preemptive strike. Anderson arrives openly. He does not ambush, does not hide. He walks down the center of the street, bayonets gleaming with sanctified inscriptions, coat snapping in a wind stirred by something beyond weather. Civilians have already cleared the district under coordinated evacuation orders, leaving only Hellsing observers at the perimeter and Millennium scouts lurking unseen in upper structures. The city holds its breath. Anderson speaks first, declaring that unchecked power outside divine hierarchy cannot be tolerated. His voice carries not hatred, but conviction sharpened into inevitability. Saitama listens with the same expression he wore when asking about dinner, then replies that he is not interested in ruling anything and would prefer not to be attacked again. The simplicity of the answer destabilizes the moral framework Anderson prepared for confrontation. He attacks anyway. The first volley of bayonet strikes with enough force to crater reinforced concrete beneath Saitama's feet. Blessed steel bends, snaps, and scatters across asphalt without drawing blood. Anderson escalates instantly, embedding scripture-infused talismans into his own flesh to trigger regenerative amplification that pushes him beyond previous limits. His speed multiplies, strikes landing in rapid succession, designed to test every angle of vulnerability. Saitama remains still. Not frozen, not overwhelmed, simply uninterested in moving more than necessary. Each strike fails to register damage, and each deflection occurs with minimal displacement, as though gravity itself prefers him stationary. Anderson's regeneration flares brighter under self-inflicted enhancement, veins glowing with fervent intensity as he prepares a final sacrificial thrust meant to pierce metaphysical barriers. Saitama exhales softly and flicks Anderson's wrist aside. The force does not obliterate him. Instead, it sends him sliding across the street into a stone facade that collapses inward without crushing him. Anderson rises again, breathing heavily but intact, regeneration compensating for shattered ribs and ruptured muscle. He stares at Saitama not with fear, but with a dawning recognition that brute sanctification will not solve this equation. Millennium chooses that moment to intervene. From concealed vantage points, specialized occult cannons fire convergence beams calibrated to intersect precisely where Anderson and Saitama stand. The objective is layered: force Saitama to respond with measurable output while eliminating a Vatican asset that has outlived strategic usefulness. The beams collide mid-air as Genos intercepts from above, redirecting two streams but failing to fully neutralize a third that strikes the pavement between combatants. The explosion tears open the street. Beneath London, Millennium's dimensional amplifier activates again, attempting to capture the resonant spike of Saitama's inevitable counteraction. Fubuki, sensing the distortion from blocks away, rushes toward the epicenter, psychic field straining against energy that feels both technological and occult. Hellsing units mobilize simultaneously, recognizing betrayal layered within intervention. Saitama steps forward, mildly annoyed now. He punches downward once. The street does not merely crack, it parts. The shockwave travels underground, shattering Millennium's amplifier array in a chain reaction that ripples through tunnels and collapses hidden command nodes. The resonance spike overwhelms every recording device, corrupting data into meaningless static. Above ground, the convergence beams dissipate as their source infrastructure disintegrates. Anderson watches the underground collapse unfold and understands something fundamental. This man is not aligned with heaven or hell. He does not scale against faith, science, or immortality. He overrides them when he chooses to act. Anderson lowers his remaining blade, not in surrender but in recalibration. The Vatican gambit has failed to define the anomaly within theological boundaries. Alucard appears beside Integra at the perimeter, observing the fractured street with visible satisfaction. He breaks systems, he remarks quietly, not as criticism but admiration. Integra nods once, aware that every institution that has attempted to categorize Saitama has instead exposed its own limits. Genos lands beside his master, system stabilized again, and confirms that Millennium's underground network in this sector has been irreparably compromised. Casualty reports indicate multiple high-ranking operatives permanently erased in the collapse. The global undead hierarchy has just suffered strategic decapitation. But the escalation is not over. Because deep within surviving Millennium Command, a final protocol activates, one designed not to test durability or capture data, but to force the anomaly into sustained engagement against something that does not rely on regeneration at all. London's power grid flickers. Across Europe, hidden facilities awaken. The war is no longer about vampires, faith, or artillery. It is about engineering a battlefield that even Saitama cannot ignore indefinitely. When London's power grid flickers, it does not fail completely, it pulses. Entire districts dim in synchronized rhythm, as though the city itself is breathing under mechanical control. Emergency generators engage automatically, but their activation feeds data into a network Millennium has quietly rebuilt beyond the reach of underground collapse. This time, they are not relying on vampires or occult amplifiers alone. They are deploying something engineered, a convergence of war science and undead persistence designed to remove regeneration from the equation entirely. Deep beneath a decommissioned aerospace facility in Eastern Europe, sealed vault doors retract for the first time in decades. Within them stands a towering construct plated in layered alloy etched with occult sigils, powered by harvested familiars bound into an artificial core. It does not regenerate. It does not rely on distributed souls. It operates on stored sacrificial energy converted into sustained output. Millennium names it simply, Dare Nachaser. Its directive is singular. Engage the anomaly in sustained, continuous combat. The construct is airlifted toward London under stealth masking, escorted by drone swarms programmed to intercept interference. Unlike previous assaults, this is not distributed chaos. It is a singular, mobile battlefield designed to adapt in real time. Millennium analysts understand they cannot outmatch Saitama's peak force. Instead, they intend to test his willingness to escalate repeatedly over extended duration, to see if indifference has limits. Hellsing detects the incoming object at high altitude, its mass inconsistent with civilian aircraft, and its energy signature, neither vampiric nor purely mechanical. Integra orders immediate evacuation of predicted impact zones while dispatching Alucard to observe without engaging unless necessary. She understands the trap. If Saitama is forced into full-force confrontation within London's core, the city may not survive the collateral consequences. Genos tracks the descending object visually and calculates impact radius within seconds. It will land in Canary Wharf, already scarred from earlier battles. He ascends to intercept, cannons charging to maximum output, and fires a concentrated beam meant to destabilize propulsion systems before touchdown. The blast connects cleanly, but the construct absorbs the energy through layered sigils that flare crimson, converting heat into amplified kinetic descent. It crashes anyway. The shockwave ripples outward, flattening glass facades and flipping armored vehicles as though they weigh nothing. The Dare Nachaser rises from the crater with deliberate motion, joints locking into combat configuration. Its voice is synthesized from bound souls, layered whispers announcing adaptive protocol engagement. It does not roar or posture. It advances. Saitama, standing several blocks away with a grocery bag salvaged from an undamaged shop, watches the construct stride through debris. He notes aloud that it looks expensive. Genos lands beside him, warning that the entity's energy core appears self-sustaining and non-regenerative, meaning destruction must target structural integrity rather than metaphysical anchors. Fubuki expands her psychic field across evacuation routes again, bracing for prolonged engagement, unlike previous instantaneous resolutions. The construct attacks first. A barrage of compressed energy spheres launches from its shoulders, each detonating with concussive force equivalent to heavy artillery. Saitama swats two aside absent-mindedly, but a third impacts a high-rise behind him, collapsing 30 floors in cascading ruin. He glances back at the destruction, mildly irritated now not by pain, but by inconvenience. The battlefield has shifted from duel to siege engine. Genos engages aggressively, targeting joint articulation points with rapid-fire plasma bursts. The construct adapts, redirecting energy absorption matrices to counter his attack patterns within seconds. Counterbeams lance outward, striking Genos midair and driving him through multiple structures before he stabilizes. His systems report escalating thermal overload as the enemy converts his output into reinforcement. Alucard observes from a rooftop, intrigued by a foe that does not bleed or regenerate, only endures. He refrains from full engagement, understanding that this confrontation is engineered specifically for Saitama. Integra watches through live feeds, recognizing Millennium's tactical evolution. They are no longer throwing immortals at an unstoppable force. They are building something designed to withstand repeated impact long enough to gather data. The Dare Nachaser locks onto Saitama directly and charges. Its fist collides with him at hypersonic velocity, generating a shockwave that shatters bridges across the Thames. Saitama slides back several meters, shoes carving twin lines into asphalt, more surprised by the displacement than harmed. He steadies himself and remarks that the thing hits harder than expected. That single sentence ripples through every observing faction. Not because he is injured, but because for the first time he moved. The construct follows with a sustained barrage, each strike calculated to force incremental reaction rather than singular decisive counter. Buildings crumble around them as Saitama deflects blows with minimal motion, careful not to escalate into city-erasing force. Fubuki strains to stabilize debris fields, veins visible at her temples as psychic pressure multiplies. King watches from a secure bunker, heartbeat echoing through reinforced walls, while analysts misinterpret the sound as restrained catastrophic readiness. Genos re-enters the fray with a new strategy, targeting the construct's ground support instead of its armor. He melts the asphalt beneath its feet, attempting to destabilize balance. The construct adapts again, deploying stabilizing spikes into bedrock, anchoring itself with inhuman precision. Its core glows brighter, sacrificial energy converting impact into stored charge. Millennium's hidden monitors record every movement. Their conclusion forms rapidly. Saitama limits himself to preserve surroundings. He is not incapable of greater force. He is unwilling to unleash it indiscriminately. The Dare Nachaser's purpose is not to win, but to force a decision, escalate fully and risk annihilating London, or continue absorbing attacks until systemic fatigue becomes measurable. Saitama looks around at the collapsing skyline, at Fubuki struggling to hold evacuation corridors intact, at Genos pushing damaged systems beyond safe thresholds. His expression shifts from boredom to mild frustration. He jumps upward, drawing the construct's attention skyward and away from the densest urban sectors. The Dare Nachaser follows. They ascend above the city, trading blows midair that ripple clouds into spirals. From the ground, observers see only flashes and shockwaves. Saitama tests a slightly stronger punch, one calibrated not to erase continents but to crack engineered alloy. The strike lands squarely against the construct's core housing. For the first time, its forward momentum halts. Hairline fractures spider across its chest plating, sigils flickering as stored energy destabilizes. The construct retaliates with a point-blank discharge that lights the night sky like a false sunrise. When the glare fades, Saitama remains suspended in air, costume singed but body untouched. He sighs. Then he pulls his fist back a little farther than before. Below, London's remaining lights flicker again, as every faction watching realizes the same thing simultaneously. The next punch will not just end the construct. It will redefine the upper boundary of restraint. High above London, suspended in torn clouds and drifting ash, Saitama hovers in silence while the Dare Nachaser recalibrates its fractured core. The construct's chest plating seals partially, not through regeneration, but through automated alloy reconfiguration, sacrificial energy rerouting to compensate for structural compromise. Its adaptive matrices spike into overdrive, interpreting Saitama's previous strike as baseline rather than anomaly. Millennium's remote observers watch with escalating anticipation, because this is the data threshold they engineered the machine to reach. Below, London trembles under atmospheric pressure shifts from every mid-air collision. Windows implode inward. Bridges groan. Hellsing's evacuation corridors are stretched to their limits as Fubuki maintains psychic stabilization across entire districts, sweat tracing down her temples as debris fields hover inches from collapse. Genos ascends again despite overheating warnings, refusing to allow his master to shoulder sustained assault alone. The battle has left the ground and become something else entirely, a skybound crucible visible across the English Channel. The Dare Nachaser strikes first again, launching a continuous beam rather than discrete blasts. The column of energy connects with Saitama midair and does not dissipate. It pushes. For several seconds, Saitama is driven backward through layers of cloud, the beam carving a glowing trench across the night sky. Observers gasp not because he appears harmed, but because he is being displaced at scale. The construct's algorithm interprets this as progress, increasing output, converting stored sacrificial reserves into amplified propulsion. Genos intercepts from the flank, firing at the construct's dorsal vents to interrupt the beam cycle. His plasma strikes rupture two stabilizers, causing the column to falter briefly. The Dare Nachaser responds instantly, deploying rotating defensive plates that deflect further attacks and retaliating with micromissile swarms calibrated to track Genos' heat signature. He destroys most mid-flight, but two detonate against his side, shredding armor and sending him spiraling downward before he recovers thrusters. On the ground, King watches the sky fracture through a reinforced bunker viewport, heartbeat resonating like distant thunder. Hellsing analysts misinterpret his silence as strategic patience, believing he is waiting for the exact moment to intervene with catastrophic force. Millennium intercepts audio of the heartbeat and logs it as anomalous subsonic resonance linked to atmospheric instability. The myth surrounding King grows even in absence of action. Alucard, standing atop a cathedral spire, narrows his gaze upward. He senses something unprecedented, a machine that does not fear death because it was never alive in the first place. He considers intervening, but refrains, recognizing that this confrontation is approaching a threshold even he does not wish to disrupt prematurely. Integra's voice crackles through comms, ordering all Hellsing units to stand clear of projected impact vectors should the skybound clash descend uncontrolled. Saitama allows the beam to continue for a moment longer, testing its persistence. His expression shifts slightly from mild irritation to thoughtful calculation. He realizes the machine is not attempting to overpower him in a single strike. It is attempting to exhaust his restraint. Every displacement risks atmospheric shockwaves that cascade downward into civilian sectors. The construct is weaponizing his consideration. He stops letting it push. The next second, he vanishes from the beam's path and reappears directly in front of the Dare Nachaser's core, moving so fast the beam continues forward without a source. He plants his hand against its chest plating and pushes back gently at first, arresting its forward momentum entirely. The construct's thrusters roar at maximum output, but it does not advance another centimeter. Millennium's analysts see the energy readings spike into chaos. The Dare Nachaser deploys its final contingency, core overload protocol. Instead of focusing output into external attack, it begins converting every stored sacrificial fragment into a singular detonation event calibrated to detonate at high altitude. The logic is brutal. If it cannot outlast Saitama, it will force him to absorb a blast equivalent to strategic bombardment without allowing time for redirection. Genos detects the overload signature and shouts a warning mid-flight. Fubuki senses the impending atmospheric rupture and expands her psychic field upward, though she knows it cannot reach that altitude effectively. Hellsing's evacuation grid braces for shockwave impact. Across Europe, satellites pivot to capture what may be the largest explosion since modern warfare began. Saitama looks at the glowing core beneath his palm and understands the intention instantly. He sighs again. Then he tightens his grip and pulls. The Dare Nachaser's core housing tears free from its armored frame with a sound like continents grinding. Saitama hurls the detached core straight upward into the upper atmosphere and follows it in a single leap. The detonation occurs seconds later, far above commercial air lanes, a blinding sphere that briefly turns night into day across half the hemisphere. Cloud systems part. Shockwaves ripple outward, harmlessly into vacuum. Saitama descends through dissipating light as the now hollow construct body falls separately, crashing into the Thames in a plume of steam. London trembles but remains standing. The sky slowly darkens back to night. Every observing institution recalculates at once. The Dare Nachaser was engineered to force escalation and measure durability under sustained assault. Instead, it has demonstrated something far more destabilizing. Saitama not only overrides immortality, not only ignores artillery, but can relocate catastrophic force beyond planetary consequence with casual precision. His restraint is not weakness. It is deliberate governance. Genos lands beside him, damaged but operational, expressing concern that further constructs may exist. Saitama nods absent-mindedly, brushing dust from his glove. He remarks that whoever keeps sending things should probably stop before he gets annoyed. In Millennium's surviving command nodes, silence spreads. Their manufactured apocalypse has failed not because it lacked power, but because it forced the anomaly to demonstrate scale beyond projection. They now face a strategic inversion. Any further escalation risks provoking force that could erase their entire network permanently. Alucard laughs softly from his distant vantage point, recognizing in Saitama something even immortality cannot rival, inevitability without malice. But as London stabilizes and emergency crews emerge cautiously, a new realization dawns across every faction. The machine did not rely on regeneration. It relied on stored souls. And when Saitama tore its core free and detonated it beyond the atmosphere, those bound fragments did not return to circulation. They were erased. That fact alone shakes the metaphysical foundation of the Hellsing universe. Because if souls themselves can be removed from the cycle by a single deliberate act, then the rules governing heaven, hell, and immortality are no longer intact. And someone, somewhere beyond Millennium, has noticed the rupture. The sky does not fully return to normal after the detonation in the upper atmosphere. For hours, faint auroras ripple across the horizon where no aurora should exist, electromagnetic distortions lingering like scars in the planet's magnetic field. Astronomical observatories report transient anomalies that defy solar explanation, and occult circles across Europe feel something far worse, a thinning. The detonation of bound souls beyond the atmosphere did not simply erase energy. It tore at the metaphysical lattice, binding the undead to continuity. Millennium, surviving leadership, understands this first. Their artificial core had contained thousands of harvested familiars, each a fragment of stolen immortality. When Saitama removed and destroyed it, those fragments did not disperse back into spiritual reservoirs. They ceased. Entire genealogies of vampiric persistence were severed in one motion. The consequence is immediate and horrifying. Lower-tier undead across Europe begin destabilizing spontaneously, their regeneration flickering unpredictably as ancestral anchors vanish. Hellsing detects the fallout within minutes. Field reports flood in describing vampires disintegrating mid-engagement, ghoul outbreaks collapsing without intervention, and occult sigils failing to activate. Sir Integra stands before a live map pulsing with red indicators that blink out one by one, not from suppression, but from structural collapse of undead continuity. The world's hidden war has just shifted beyond human orchestration. Alucard feels it viscerally. Standing alone in the courtyard of Hellsing headquarters, he closes his eyes as distant familiars within him shudder. His existence is layered atop millions of consumed lives, each bound to his will through centuries of bloodshed. For the first time since he became what he is, he senses the possibility that those bindings are not immutable. The anomaly in yellow has proven that souls can be erased absolutely. He begins to laugh. Not in fear, but in anticipation. Because if Saitama can invalidate bound souls externally, then perhaps the only meaningful test left is to confront him without limiters at all. Alucard walks into Integra's command chamber and requests full authorization level 0 release, not to defend London, not to suppress Millennium, to face the anomaly as he truly is. Integra hesitates longer than before. Level 0 is not tactical deployment. It is catastrophic unveiling, the unleashing of every familiar, every consumed life, every battlefield Alucard has ever absorbed. It transforms him from singular entity into living war. Yet she recognizes the strategic inflection point. The world's metaphysical balance is destabilizing. If Saitama remains untested against full immortal saturation, fear-driven institutions will escalate blindly again. She gives the order. Across London, seals binding Alucard's deeper states unravel. The air thickens with the scent of ancient battlefields as black tides pour outward from his body, forming ranks upon ranks of spectral soldiers, crusaders, mercenaries, and forgotten armies spanning centuries. Streets flood with manifestations not of shadow alone, but of memory weaponized. The city does not burn this time. It darkens under the weight of accumulated death. Saitama stands at the edge of Trafalgar Square, looking at the expanding sea of familiars with mild confusion. He comments that it seems crowded. Genos positions himself protectively despite knowing his firepower cannot permanently thin an army sustained by distributed souls. Fubuki feels the psychic pressure multiply beyond anything she has previously contained. This is not localized threat, but historic density manifesting physically. Alucard appears at the forefront of his legion, coat restored, eyes blazing with exhilaration. He addresses Saitama directly, explaining that this is not escalation born of hostility but necessity. If the anomaly can erase souls, then he must test whether that erasure scales against millions. The battlefield is no longer city infrastructure or engineered machines. It is existential volume. The Legion advances. Genos unleashes sweeping incineration arcs that carve trenches through spectral ranks, yet for every dozen erased, more surge forward, sustained by Alucard's bound continuity. Fubuki lifts entire columns of advancing familiars and crushes them telekinetically, buying seconds at immense psychic cost. King remains at a fortified observation point, heartbeat echoing like war drums, causing entire phalanxes of familiars to hesitate at the edge of engagement. Saitama watches for a moment. Then he steps forward into the tide. His first punch clears an avenue through the Legion, erasing thousands in a single shockwave that ripples outward like a vacuum implosion. The second punch sweeps laterally, removing entire battalions from existence rather than scattering them. Unlike previous engagements, the erasure is not localized to individual targets. It propagates through bound connections, severing chains of immortality in cascading sequence. Alucard feels it immediately. Each erased familiar is not merely destroyed, it is subtracted from his internal infinity. For the first time in his unlife, his numbers decrease irreversibly under direct confrontation. He laughs louder, exhilarated by genuine attrition. This is what he sought, an opponent who does not simply wound but reduces. The legion intensifies, compressing inward from all directions to overwhelm through sheer volume. London trembles under the density of manifested history. Hellsing units withdraw to perimeter zones, unable to meaningfully intervene without being absorbed into the tide. Millennium watches in horrified fascination as their centuries-old apex predator engages in battle that risks permanent diminishment. Saitama increases output slightly. He does not shout, he does not posture, he moves faster. Within seconds, entire sectors of the Legion vanish in expanding hemispheres of absence. The air clears where fists pass. Bound souls do not retreat, they disappear. Alucard regenerates physically each time Saitama strikes connect, but his reserves dwindle. Then Alucard escalates further. He abandons singular form entirely, dispersing himself across the Legion so that every familiar becomes partially him. The battlefield becomes one distributed entity, impossible to isolate, each soldier bearing his grin. This is the ultimate expression of immortal saturation. Attack anywhere and you attack him everywhere. Saitama pauses. He tilts his head, considering the mechanics. Then he clenches his fist. The punch that follows does not target a body. It targets the space the Legion occupies. The shockwave expands in perfect sphere, silent at first, then roaring as atmosphere rushes inward to fill sudden absence. Spectral armies dissolve not in explosion but in subtraction. Entire centuries of consumed lives blink out simultaneously. When the air stabilizes, the square is empty except for drifting dust. Alucard reforms alone at the center, breathing hard. His regeneration functions, but his numbers are reduced dramatically. For the first time since his existence began, he is closer to singularity than infinity. He looks at Saitama with something approaching reverence. And in that silence, every faction watching understands the irreversible truth. Immortality is no longer safe. The morning after the atmospheric detonation reads like a planetary aftershock. News feeds no longer whisper about an isolated London emergency, but broadcast raw footage of undead lineages failing in real time across multiple continents. And intelligence channels light up with emergency markers that have never been used in concert before. Hellsing's situation room fills with analysts, diplomats, and military liaisons who speak in clipped, exhausted sentences as they reconcile centuries-old doctrine with an unprecedented phenomenon. Entire vampiric bloodlines are collapsing because their metaphysical anchors no longer respond to the old scripts. Integra moves through the room with a map of hit points laid over timelines, issuing orders that feel less like commands and more like triage, because what they face is not a single army, but an unraveling infrastructure of immortality whose failure will cascade through every hidden war the world has never acknowledged. Alucard understands the stakes more intimately than anyone, and he feels them as loss rather than victory, which changes the tenor of the conflict instantly. Where before he reveled in attrition, now he recognizes an erasure that removes not just enemies but the raw material that made him whole, and the knowledge distills into a dangerous curiosity. He is diminished numerically but not conceptually. The familiar thousands that once answered him are absent, and that absence teaches him how much of his identity relied on the circulation of those fragments, meaning his calculus for escalation has shifted from endless consumption to targeted preservation. Integra authorizes a recalibrated mission profile focused on containment and reconstruction. Stop the bleeding where possible, document the rupture so policy can be written around it, and prevent opportunists from harvesting the void for political or private power, because the vacuum left by the collapse will attract predators who have always preferred chaos to order. Millennium fractures along predictable yet brutal fault lines. Leadership who once favored grand gambits now squabble over salvage and secrecy, while splinter cells attempt to deploy improvised Soul-Anchor array prototypes, hastily assembled devices that pair occult sigils with industrial processors in an attempt to reconstitute continuity by brute force anchoring. This is the first real tactical development that changes the shape of engagement. Where they once threw hordes at the problem, they now attempt to surgically retether what was erased by constructing artificial anchors, broadcasting occult resonance into ruined vaults and cathedrals in a desperate attempt to reseed regeneration. Hellsing and allied services quickly classify these arrays as a higher-order threat because they are not merely weapons. They are attempts to rewrite metaphysical law through aggregated technology, and if any succeed even partially, the world will be left with a new, more dangerous hybrid of engineered immortality. Fubuki becomes central to countering this new tactic, devising a psychic feedback methodology that is the second major tactical innovation in days. She and Genos coordinate a paired assault where his electromagnetic dampeners create windows of lowered occult fidelity, while Fubuki channels telekinetic resonance to collapse anchor lattices from within, producing localized voids that prevent Millennium's arrays from finding purchase. The fusion feels improvisational, but it works. Genos' hardware takes punishments it was never designed to endure, and Fubuki endures psychic backlash that leaves her hollow for hours afterward. Yet together they are able to disrupt prototype anchoring nodes long enough for Hellsing teams to secure and dismantle them. This development changes the operational tempo. The battlefield is no longer purely kinetic or arcane. It becomes iterative engineering and counter-engineering in the public eye, and every successful disruption forces Millennium to escalate to increasingly dangerous prototypes. King's presence continues to reverberate even as myths around him harden into doctrine. Where Hellsing units might move in a hard sweep, they now sometimes pause at his sightline because the psychological calculus of presence has proven tactical value, and in at least 2 documented skirmishes enemy units aborted maneuvers once they detected his concentrated aura. Analysts exploit this without ever revealing the truth of his impotence, positioning King as a decoy of deterrence in reconnaissance operations where hesitation among adversaries increases the chance of successful anchor seizures. King himself says almost nothing. His terror remains private, and his silence becomes weaponized by allies, which is both a moral cost and strategic advantage, because adversaries cannot know whether the legend is genuine until after they have already retreated. Saitama's interventions evolve too, and here the narrative introduces a third procedural shift. He does not simply erase masses anymore. He targets core nodes of continuity with deliberate minimalism to avoid unnecessary civilian collateral and to deny Millennium the ability to harvest rupture byproducts. Where earlier he removed legions with hemispheric punches, now he walks into abandoned crypts and data vaults and disables anchor generators with single, precise gestures. A fingertip against a conduit, a flick that severs a runic filament, and the resulting absence propagates through associated networks far more efficiently than wholesale destruction would have. His detachment persists. He still complains about ruined grocery stock and the inconvenience of scheduling, but the effect of his choices becomes systemic. By eliminating structural anchors rather than slaughtering manifest forms, Saitama collapses regenerative capacity at the infrastructure level and forces the world's undead systems into a mode of permanent contraction rather than cyclical resurgence. Global political and cultural ripple effects follow immediately and are not merely background noise. Religious authorities fracture between reconciliation and rage as doctrinal certainties fail. Black markets bloom overnight for salvaged sigils and alleged erasure tech. And several states quietly embargo research data that could destabilize nuclear command chains if commodified. Interpol and allied defense ministries draft an emergency multilateral mandate, a binding charter that creates a legal framework for dealing with metaphysical collapse and authorizes Hellsing and vetted partners to operate transnationally under strict oversight. A pragmatic move that recognizes old national boundaries are irrelevant when the fabric of immortality frays. This bureaucratic pivot creates as much friction as it does coordination. Some nations refuse to sign, while mercenary conglomerates and private collectors race to claim relics and ruin, turning neutral zones into contested markets where ethics buckle under price. Alucard's reaction to the systemic collapse evolves into cunning rather than wrath. He approaches Integra privately and proposes a dangerous collaboration that was unthinkable days before. Not a reconstitution of the old order, but a negotiated containment that trades some of Hellsing's sovereignty for access to archival knowledge. Alucard can only share now that he knows what it truly costs. He will not give up his autonomy lightly, but he recognizes that an unregulated void will consume more than his enemies, and his suggestion carries with it a new threat. If denied, he will have no ideological restraint left to stop him from reclaiming what was lost by any means necessary, which introduces a looming choice that will force institutions to decide whether to bind an immortal ally with legal chains or risk him acting outside oversight. Across the globe, Millennium's last coherent cells prepare a contingency with desperate clarity to launch a dispersed network of anchor proxies that rely on living host sacrifice rather than collected familiars, shifting from stored souls to living pulse anchors that would forcibly reassign immortality at catastrophic human cost. Hellsing, the Vatican, and allied military planners intercept chatter about the protocol and move to preemptively dismantle known nodes, authorizing covert strikes into compromised territories tonight, an operation that will combine surgical military force, psychic disruption, and Alucard-guided occult containment. The choice is irreversible. If any anchor proxies come online, humanity will be forced into a new dark calculus where the undead could be engineered again from the living, and the world will shift from managing anomalies to defending the sanctity of life itself. The world has stopped pretending the rupture is containable. Governments no longer leak. They bargain in secret corridors and sign documents that read like treaties with the impossible. In basement war rooms beneath three capitals, engineers and occultists work side by side, drafting a final contingency, a synthesis of hardware and sacrament designed not to kill the anomaly, but to remake the metaphysical ledger so that immortality can be rebuilt under human law. They call the program the Ascension Engine, a name meant to sound clinical in press briefings, but what it actually is would be described elsewhere as hubris. An orbital lattice of sigil-embedded satellites, ground-based anchor vaults, and a core reactor that requires living resonance to bootstrap. The plan is simple in its logic and monstrous in its calculus. Harvest devotion, bind it into a machine, and use engineered erasure to reconstitute immortality on terms the consortium can control. Integra reads the dossiers with the same flat expression she uses for bad intelligence, and every line forces her to weigh sovereignty against survival. Hellsing's analysts argue in clipped, efficient sentences that the Ascension Engine would restore a balance favorable to human oversight, while others counter that weaponizing souls, even those reclaimed from hostile hands, collapses ethical frameworks into legal loopholes. Alucard listens to the debate not as counsel but as possibility. For him, the engine is an armature around which he could rebuild the scale of his dominion without theft or covert binding. He does not plead for it because he wants power. He proposes the only test left that could satisfy him: merge with the engine, become its sentience, and see if there exists anything in the universe that does not bend. Saitama is not on the committees. He is still more interested in whether the convenience store near Trafalgar has any durable bread left, and when he hears rumors of a machine meant to remake the world, he frowns only because the idea sounds like a bureaucratic inconvenience. Genos, by contrast, runs simulations in real time, burning cycles through probability trees that measure output, feedback loops, and failure modes. He informs Fubuki that the engine's bootstrap will require sustained release events on a scale the world cannot absorb without systemic collapse, essentially asking dozens of measured erasures to be performed in quick succession. Fubuki hears the math and says quietly that the political will to authorize such a calculus means someone has already decided whose lives count as expendable. King's heartbeat grows into a drumbeat that ripples through Hellsing's secure observation deck, and officers interpret the sound as portent rather than panic. It narrows strategy in surprising ways because wherever King's aura is present, operational aggression falters. Some commanders elect to stall authorization simply because the myth of catastrophic consequence seems real enough to delay the vote. That hesitation buys time, and yet it also shifts decisions into darker hands. A private consortium aligned with Millennium's surviving technocrats, brokers of salvage and occult salvagemen with cash and no conscience, offers funding for the engine under conditions that remove national oversight. The money creates plausible deniability, and deniability is all the legal shade some will need. Millennium does not wait for polite authorization. They pivot fast to the only maneuver left to them: deliver a living, compliant nucleus to power the engine and ensure its control aligns with their interests. They approach Alucard with a proposition framed as inevitability and flattery. Bind with us, they say, and we will supply the lattice, the ritual arrays, the ceremonial framing that will let you ascend beyond the limits of bound fragments. Alucard accepts the language of duel and exchange, not domination. He offers himself not because he doubts consequence, but because he wants to test the anomaly under terms where the stakes are total. Integra hears of the overture and understands the knife edge between desperate alliance and catastrophe. If Alucard merges with an engine housed by political mercenaries, there will be no oversight left to hold him to any promise. She authorizes a constrained cooperation instead. Hellsing will supervise ritual parameters and retain veto over any systemic decisions made by the engine, even if that means binding Alucard to terms of his own choosing. It is a dangerous gambit, the first new tactical development in days, a legal ritual firewall intended to limit metaphysical transformation through covenant and sigil, not bullets. The covenant is fragile, written in ink and steel, and in the teeth of political compromise, but it buys a single window. The engine can be activated under conditions that force public accountability rather than some shadow cabal's private pact. Alucard agrees to the chain, but he does so laughing at the illusions of control, and the laugh carries the weight of centuries. The engine's ground vaults begin warm-up protocols beneath Canary Wharf and behind decommissioned forts along the coast, each site wired to occult conduits rendered by Hellsing scribes and Millennium engineers in uneasy partnership. Satellites lift in clusters. The orbital lattice forms the halo that will channel terrestrial resonance outward. The true cost of activation is laid bare in whispered briefings. Millions of living pulses will not be taken as collateral, but as fuel, redirected through ritualized consent frameworks that the engine will interpret and then transmute into anchor lattice patterns. Nations sign away citizens, privacy with legal language about emergency requisition and national survival. And in a world exhausted by loss, the trade-off becomes tragically plausible. Fubuki and Genos are dispatched to the lead activation site to attempt a different kind of mitigation, a tactical development that is both technological and psychic. Together, They will deploy a feedback matrix that attempts to diffuse the engine's initial resonance spike by converting intended erasure into localized non-erasures, essentially trying to create psychic dampers that render sacrifice logs inert. The idea is brilliant in theory and brittle in practice. It relies on an untested seam between kinetic dampening and occult fidelity modulation. If it works, it will reduce required human cost by orders of magnitude. If it fails, it will make those orders certain. Saitama watches the controlled mobilization without anger. He watches because the world is moving pieces in ways that inconvenience him, and because people are already deciding who will die to save what remains. When the engine's countdown begins, the first ceremonial extraction commences at a remote site alleged to be populated only by volunteers. The ritual proceeds with grim efficiency as the engine harmonizes living pulses into its core, and Fubuki's dampers flicker like candles in a wind that grows steadily colder. For a moment, the dampers hold enough coherence that the extraction reads as contained, and analysts breathe with relief. Then one anchor fails. A node in a satellite array misaligns under occult strain, and the supposed volunteer site is connected instead to a cluster of urban hospitals several cities away because of a routing error made by a contracted firm in the panic. The engine pulls a resonance spike and feeds on the living pulse it finds, not the one consented. Alarms scream across command nets, legal language collapses into human screams, and Hellsing teams realize the engine's moral architecture has already failed. Saitama hears the broadcasts and moves because someone made lives expendable and because the noise reached him. He arrives as the engine's core hums into a higher octave and sees doctors and nurses in the path of ritual convergence, faces frozen in disbelief. He does not shout. He does not negotiate. He walks forward, not as Deus ex machina, but as an inconvenient fact placed amid human catastrophe. His first contact with the engine's outer casing is not a punch extended for demonstration. It is an intentional strike aimed at the mechanism feeding on the living. His finger presses an access seam. The resulting rupture is immediate and not easily contained. The engine's safety interlocks trigger fail-safes that begin cascading shutdowns, and yet a feedback loop already initiated refuses to be reversed. Energy that has been committed to anchor lattice formation cannot be unfired. As technicians work frantically to reroute and terminate processes, the engine responds by transferring committed resonance into fallback nodes, rudimentary anchor proxies seeded across several continents to preserve continuity. The proxies engage. Human pulses reroute in bursts, and whole neighborhoods register as being folded into a nascent metaphysical lattice. The world watches in real time as lives are snapped into a process that will not be undone by any legislation or apology. The engine's misrouting has transformed accidental sacrifice into irreversible binding. The ascension engine's misrouting has already carved its mark into reality when Saitama arrives at the lead vault, and the scene is a theater of moral collapse. Families folded into ritual lattices, sanctified wards failing, engineers turned into conduits against their will, as alarms scream and legal counsel becomes irrelevant. And when he sees technicians still reaching out to stop the process with trembling hands, he does what he has done from the beginning of this intrusion. He moves to end the mechanism causing human sacrifice rather than argue about its paperwork. Genos and Fubuki flank him, Genos shielding medics with withered plating, while Fubuki throws up psychic dampers to cushion the cascade of ritual feedback that now flickers in unpredictable patterns. An interplay of technology and the occult that was never meant to operate under pressure, and is now tearing itself apart from within. Integra's voice comes in clipped on every channel, a brittle order to restrain and to salvage what legal ground remains. And Alucard, who once laughed at human machinery, strides forward in a different mood, not simply rivalrous, but keenly aware that the engine represents a choice to remake souls on a ledger, and that any such ledger will change everything he has been into something unrecognizable. The scene resolves into a single, inevitable choice. Stop the engine now and accept permanent rupture, or allow it to complete and watch the world trade its moral center for engineered immortality. Alucard does not step aside when Saitama approaches the core. Instead, he moves to fuse with the remaining lattice, to become the engine's living sentinel and thus give vampiric order a chance at reconstruction. And his intent ignites a counter-escalation that turns the final hours into a theological debate fought with teeth and architecture. Hellsing's covenants bind him with legal ritual, but cannot change what centuries of consumption taught him about hunger and continuity. So he opens himself anyway and pours whatever remained of nested familiars into the lattice, in a deliberate act that is both offering and reclamation. The vault hums with a terrible compatibility as sacrificial and reclaimed pulses begin to sync, making the machine sing in a register that promises resurrection on corporate terms. Millennium's splinter cells, watching through hacked feeds, move to protect the pilot nodes with desperate ferocity, because their investors have spent too much to abandon a payoff now within reach. And Vatican agents likewise converge to execute last-ditch exorcisms, because failure of the engine would mean irrecoverable theological loss. Genos launches into the breach without hesitation, as his core reports cascading failures if the lattice stabilizes. Trading armor for time while Fubuki strains to hold psychic seems from unweaving into chaotic erasure. Saitama stands at the precise axis where algorithm meets ritual, looking at the glowing core as if it were an appliance with a faulty fuse. And because the choice before him is painfully simple, stop the machine or allow the slaughter of souls to be made permanent, he decides. He decides with the deliberate minimalism he has always favored. He does not shout, he does not rage, he chooses to act, and his action is absolute. Saitama slides a single, measured strike into the lattice's central node, not to pulverize it into spectacle, but to sever the concept the device depends upon. Consent as currency, life as fuel, immortality as commodity. The impact is not a cinematic eruption. It is a metaphysical excision whose physics ripple outward through code and sigil alike, collapsing binding equations into null. Satellites in the orbital halo flicker and die in a pattern that is not random but clean as a scalpel. And for the first time, every occultist and engineer watching understands the nature of what has been severed. The engine's architecture does not just store souls, it traffics them, and that trafficking has been brought to a stop by an act that refuses the machine's premise. Where the lattice had begun pulling living pulses into proxy anchors, the seams now seal with absence, and the living people once bound within the vault find themselves returned to bewildered, exhausted life, because the mechanism that forced them out of agency has been eliminated at the level of principle. The cost is immediate and irreversible in ways no policy can reverse. The engine's fallback proxies, initiated when safety interlocks first failed, do not neatly uncommit because the metaphysical economy they opened cannot be refunded, and millions of living pulses stamped into emergent anchor seeds remain statistically entangled with degraded lattice fragments scattered across oceans and hidden vaults. Fubuki screams once, a psychic sound that rends the air as she attempts to trace the entanglement and finds the pattern to be not repairable but absorbable. A new category of casualty, where lives are not dead, but partially reallocated into metaphysical debt. Governments announce emergency declarations that are no longer about stopping a machine, but about accounting for a world in which the metaphysical ledger has been scorched. Legal scholars draft clauses that will follow every libertarian phrase about consent with the cold parenthetical of irreversible entanglement. Churches split and reconsolidate overnight. Some claim Saitama's act was divine just verdict, while others denounce it as blasphemous nullification. And protests that once clustered in the streets mutate into legal class actions as families sue to retrieve faith, memory, and the status of their loved ones. The balance of power shifts in the span of an afternoon. Vampiric dynasties are destabilized irrevocably. Millennium salvage economy collapses into criminality, and the Hellsing organization inherits a new, unwelcome function, stewarding the remnants of metaphysical law. Alucard survives the severing in a new configuration that satisfies none of his previous appetites. The engine has siphoned away fragments that will never return, and where he once drew infinity, he now feels edges and absence, a finite palette that recalibrates his desires toward preservation rather than consumption. He laughs, but it is a different laugh now, quieter, edged with loss, and he agrees with Integra in a way he would not have before. Some things cannot be rebuilt without losing what they were meant to protect. Anderson withdraws his men, chastened into ecclesiastical rhetoric, because the theological certainty he sought has been undone by a single, unconcerned hand that refused to treat souls as either currency or prize. King's aura remains valuable as myth, and Hellsing leverages it to stabilize international accords that demand oversight and transparency. But the policy scaffolding is new and fragile. Immortality as an institution has been reduced to myth and criminal enterprise, and the world must now reckon with mortality writ differently. The final, irreversible architecture of the post-engine world emerges in bureaucratic, legal, and ritual layers that are as mundane as they are epical. International covenants redefine personhood in metaphysical terms. New enforcement agencies are chartered to oversee occult technologies, and a forensic discipline arises to audit spiritual claims because the nation-state cannot allow private parties to traffic in souls again. Private collectors hoard fragments and black markets attempt to sell anchor salvage to the highest bidder, but without engine-level distribution the fragments are inert. They can wound but not reproduce the old order, and that limitation creates a slow, grinding attrition to organized undead resurgence. Saitama, indifferent as ever, returns to a life punctuated by grocery lists and the occasional awkward press conference where reporters try and fail to fit his decision into ideology. He remains emotionally detached and casually observant, his presence continuing to reshape strategy and law simply by existing. But permanence always births consequence, and the last line of this new order is a creeping, bureaucratic one. Across darknet channels and corrupted relay nets, a half-broken protocol begins to circulate, an algorithmic sigil designed to find loopholes in the scorched metaphysical ledger and seed primitive anchor points in places engine protocols never reached. It is not full resurrection. It is not even organized yet, but it is a beginning. And because the world has been changed forever by one decisive act, the scramble to exploit, control, or stop that beginning is already underway.